welcome back. For those of whom this is the first time, so this is the kind of the monthly Spia webinar in which we try to collectively think about and so introduce kind of different ways of thinking of impact assessment in CGIAR and introduce different types of research. And we are happy that with the community that both does these type of studies, but also the community that may in the CGIAR that may benefit or use some of those studies. And so we're very happy to have Dan Gilligan with us today, who for many of you will not need an introduction, but for the few of you that do, so Dan is at IFPRI and has kind of a long interest, a long-standing interest on related to gender-related questions and intra-household-related questions, including, of course, around CGIAR innovations. And so he will kind of present some of the kind of talk through a little bit kind of more big picture about kind of how in a particular case, which is the case of the biofortified food, the research agenda around gender questions kind of has been shaped and kind of the type of things that they learned in this work going forward. And the idea very much is that this is kind of to think through as an example, as a way of how the type of research you'll talk about can help think through also new questions that are coming up in the One CGIAR context, including in the new initiatives in the gender platform, etc. And of course, the CGIAR has a very long tradition in excellent research around gender, and I'm happy to see some of the names in attendance that have contributed to this, and many of the names, which is great. And so there is an opportunity, I guess, to build on this in this new stage. And so partly as to help facilitate that, we also invited Kyle Murphy, who will at the end, after Dan's talk, give a short presentation. So Kyle is is representing the JPAL and CGIAN, so the ATAI initiative, which is an initiative that funds research on agricultural innovations and productivity. That some of you may be aware of. We've been circulating, or Spia has been circulating information about this and about their calls related to gender, their specific gender interest too. So Kyle will explain that a little bit, how it works and to what extent some of the questions relevant for the CGIAR probably overlap with the interest of that initiative. So let me stop at that, because we really want to hear of those two men to talk about gender today. But so take that as a plea for all the women in the room, obviously, to come in as soon as possible. Thank you. Hi, Jen. Over to you, Dan.
Okay. Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Ricardo, for the invitation and for helping to facilitate this. I'm just going to share my screen. I think you can see that. And let me know if that's now on. Oh, it's not.
Yes.
Is it on full screen?
Not yet.
There we go. I think now you should see full screen. Okay. Thanks, Karen. And so I won't be able to see the chat, or so if there are questions or comments for clarification, you can please just come in. But otherwise, I'll just go through and we'll have time for discussion afterwards. So thanks again. I appreciate the opportunity here. So just by way of introduction, I'm Dan Gilligan. I'm at IFPRI, as Karen mentioned, the Deputy Director in the Poverty, Health, and Nutrition Division. I'm also co-lead working with Nicolene DeHaan, who's lead of the HarvestPlus initiative in the CGIAR, one of the new research initiatives, which is on harnessing gender and social equality for resilience. What I want to do today is give a bit of an overview first of on using rigorous impact evaluations to think about how gender shapes effectiveness of CGIAR innovations. And the focus here is quite broadly on a number of types of innovations that the CGIAR has supported in the past. In many cases, this is CGIAR research, or research that has been produced by folks who were at the CGIAR or started it at CGIAR. And so I'll provide a bit of overview of some of that research before getting into the case study that Karen mentioned around biofortification and the role of gender and biofortification, an example in Uganda. So I want to start with just some kind of high-level messages about sort of how we think about the role of gender here. So it's important to recognize that restricted gender norms, gender-blind technologies, low access to resources, and policy failures and failures in governance continue to limit the livelihoods, agency, and empowerment of women in their communities. So the resulting gender inequality is truly massive and actually hinders development. And that inequality has actually been documented to be made worse by climate change, documented in the recent report by the World Economic Forum. Research that's designed from the beginning to understand these gender dimensions, and for CGI research that could be on agri-food systems, on value chain development, improving diets, poverty reduction, and climate change adaptation, just as some examples. If we design research from the beginning to understand the gender dimensions of these areas of research, well, this often improves our understanding of these challenges. So gender differentiated effects, as you survey this research, they're actually quite complex. They certainly vary by context, but when gender is taken seriously and sort of brought into the research from the beginning, it often reveals important dimensions of both constraints that women face, sources of inequality, but also of potential solutions. So getting to impact evaluation, there's many ways that rigorous impact evaluations can be designed to study the role of gender. And by rigorous impact evaluations, just by way of terminology here, because I found as the initiatives have been developed and as the One CGIAR process has grown, in many conversations with folks across the system, people use different terminology to refer to what I will call here rigorous impact evaluations or causal impact evaluations. So these are impact studies that are designed to measure the causal effect of a program on an outcome against a counterfactual. And what's critical here is that the design is intended to be causal, so that at the end of the day, you can say that the measured effects are actually due directly to the program or policy that you're studying. So, as I mentioned, there's many ways that rigorous impact evaluations can be designed to bring in gender dimensions and study how gender shapes outcomes and how removing barriers to women's equality can actually accelerate development. So, as I said, I'll present several examples here. Before I do that, I just want to motivate kind of our thinking on this by using a conceptual framework that was developed as part of the HarvestPlus initiative proposal. It's actually adapted from work by on a really excellent report developed by Jemima Njuki and Agnes Kiesenbing and others that just shows the role of gender in the agri-food system. So if we think about the presence of, there are both structural gender inequalities like harmful norms and unequal responsibilities, as well as gendered shocks and vulnerabilities. I mentioned climate change already. Conflict often has important gender dimensions that the pandemic certainly has. These things come in and enter into 4 dimensions of inequality that we focus on. There's women's agency, gendered social norms, access to and control over resources, and policies and governance. And each of these has both sort of individual level components and systemic level components that need to be addressed. And they also show up both in sort of formal institutions, formal markets such as labor markets, as well as informal markets, informal labor markets, and informal institutions. And you see there in the purple arrows, these are the sort of 4 approaches that HarvestPlus is taking to try to address these. But they give examples. They're useful examples of the types of research that the CGIAR will do going forward, and how gender may enter. So this has to do with, for example, testing bundled socio-technical innovations that combine, say, agricultural seed technologies with strategies to actually improve their take-up by women. It could also have to do with reducing normative constraints that limit women's resilience Gender responsive social protection is going to be one of the work packages there. And then other strategies to promote women's voice through improved governance. Okay, so again, I'm hoping here just to motivate sort of the various levels and sort of dimensions through which gender enters into our agri-food systems research and how gender inequality can play an important role. Okay, with that as sort of background, I'm going to get sort of directly into talking about gender differentiated research within rigorous impact evaluation designs. And so for the next few minutes, I just want to give some examples of how gender has been brought into causal impact evaluations in some thoughtful ways. So I have a number of studies here. These are, this is a huge area of research. Obviously, I've just selected some examples that, as I mentioned, featured CG research by CG researchers. And I'll kind of use that to sort of frame somewhat of a typology of the types of impact evaluations where gender has been brought in. So the first is sort of the simplest, and that's why I'm not sort of giving examples here, but just looking at treatment effect heterogeneity. So as you conduct an impact evaluation, if you study how the program or policy has differential effects on women and men or on boys and girls, then that's certainly bringing in a gender dimension. In some ways, it's relatively easy to do. It doesn't require really dramatic changes in say survey design, other than making sure that you've separately identified men and women. And in some cases, this can turn out to be really important and informative. If you look at dimensions of human capital investment, for example, in nutrition and education, often there are important gender dimensions and gender differences in both investment and outcomes. And so that's a really, that's a good example of where it's very valuable to make sure that you sort of identify just the heterogeneity of effects on boys and girls, for example. Next is a really big area of research on measuring intra-household decision-making, agency, and women's empowerment. And to do this in a rigorous impact evaluation, so this requires actually carefully measuring those things by changing or expanding the survey instrument. And there's research across the CG that's been done on various strategies to improve intra-household decision-making, agency, and women's empowerment in the context of different types of investment. So it could be in agriculture. There's a lot of work on this on social protection, in other areas. So I'll highlight one study here. It's the Kiesembing et al. Paper from 2021. And in each case, I'm going to, well, in most cases, I'm going to describe kind of the study design, and then I'm going to tell you a bit about their findings. And again, this is just kind of a survey here, so this is going to move kind of quickly. But in their impact evaluation of Angel Project, which this paper reports, this was designed as a randomized controlled trial, where in Bangladesh they bundled agriculture, nutrition, and gender interventions in varying combinations and treatment arms, including a treatment arm that had all three sources of interventions. And these were provided in all cases to men and women jointly. So part of what's really interesting here, and what is quite rare, in fact, is that men and women were sort of brought in kind of jointly on all aspects here, including sort of gender-focused interventions. So what they find is that all of these interventions improve women's empowerment, and that the nutrition training improved men's gender attitudes on women's responsibility in childcare and cooking. So again, the kind of contribution here is relatively uncommon evidence about sort of the benefits of having men involved as well in, say, trainings on nutrition or trainings on that are meant to sort of bring women into decision making, and they find really broad effects within this literature. So one of the interesting or important tools here is a survey instrument where you ask both men and women to report on control over decision making across a variety of domains. So this is usually paired with questions about women's and men's control over assets. And so, but the decision making is often around sort of the domains of household activity, having to do with agricultural production, with childcare practices, with decisions about taking produce to market, for example. And you ask separately these questions to men and women, and then that's commonly used to measure or to sort of look at effects of decision making. And so this nice paper by Kate Ambler and others look at those survey modules, and it's the first case that I've seen where they explore what happens when there are differences in recall or reports between men and women, when they essentially disagree on whether women play a role in some aspect of decision making. And what they find is that there are, in fact, differences in recall between men and women on asset ownership and decision making. And when that happens, so when women have, they show that when women have a bigger role in asset ownership or decision making, as reported by them, that is associated with improved outcomes, but that improvement is smaller if they've disagreed in that reporting with men. So where women and men are on the same page, essentially about women's involvement in decision making in the household, that in those households, that's associated with actually better outcomes for women. And I just want to, I mentioned, you see in the slide there, use ProWeigh. Please, there's a wonderful set of tools if you haven't used them before on measuring intra-household decision-making, agency, and women's empowerment. And this is now widely used in many dozens of countries and over more than 100 projects. And there's been a huge investment there. And so I encourage you to sort of explore these tools if you haven't used them and bring them into your research as a way to do this measurement. Okay, so next I want to shift to bring in an example about mixed methods designs, where where combining quantitative and qualitative assessments help to improve the understanding of underlying mechanisms behind average treatment effects. So often, without qualitative research, we can follow the impact evaluation design to measure carefully and precisely measure impacts on primary and secondary outcomes. But we're often somewhat limited to go below that to understand sort of what the mechanisms are that are driving that, or some of the more nuanced dimensions of actually reaching those effects. And that's where bringing in qualitative assessments through focus group discussions, key informant interviews can really make a big difference. And so I brought in just one example here of some research in Egypt, which was an impact evaluation of the TACAFul program, Egypt's national safety net program. And I brought it in part because it also uses another impact evaluation methodology rather than a randomized controlled trial. We took advantage here of the targeting approach to this program, which was targeted using a proxy means test. And when you have an index of well-being as a sort of primary targeting method, and there's a cutoff on that index to tell you households below the cutoff will be eligible for the program because they're relatively poor, and those above the cutoff are not, then a regression discontinuity is a really effective design to measure differences in outcomes as a result of being in the program based on the relative arbitrariness of the location of the cutoff. It's as if you have a localized experiment. And so RDD is generally considered to be very effective when you have that type of a setup. And so in this paper, RDD was used to measure the impact of TACAFul overall on household consumption and poverty and other outcomes, but included in there was looking at effects on dimensions of decision-making and women's empowerment. There's a really big literature on the effects of cash transfers on women's empowerment, and lots of evidence of strong effects, but also evidence where, in fact, cash transfers did not improve women's outcomes. And here we actually see that transfers, and these transfers were given to women. Women were the target recipient in each household. That when women did not have primary education, that in fact the transfers targeted to women actually reduced their role in decision-making in the household. So the arrival of this additional funds and these transfers actually, if you will, spurred new conversations in the household and men became more involved in some dimensions of decision making as a result of this sort of new arrival of income. And we used a detailed qualitative assessment working with partners in Egypt to learn quite a bit more about that. And that's where we sort of learned more about sort of the primacy of men in many aspects of decision making, including whether women work, when and how they leave the home, and you know, what we found here was that women, so their overall kind of control over decision making declined, although they noted a decline in stress as well, and general improvement in sort of household well-being. So it's a mixed story, but certainly the negative effects on their control over decision making were robust. Okay. I want to cover another couple of examples. So there's some really interesting work on the importance of gender in social networks and diffusion of technology. So a lot of the C technologies that the CG is producing and that we hope to study can propagate and spread through diffusion. And the orange sweet potato that I'll talk about in a minute is one example. I brought in here the work by Beeman and Dillon, that looks at the role of gender in social networks, specifically for diffusion and specifically for diffusion of information. So this is designed as a randomized controlled trial, and they randomized whether farmers received information about technology either directly in one treatment arm or through social networks in other treatment arms. And in each case, they had men and women stratified in each treatment arm to sort of receive this information. And again, either directly or through social networks. What they find is that women are less likely to learn about a technology from social networks, that the social networks, that some dimensions of the social networks actually made it harder for women to actually access the technology, and that there were gender differences in social learning. So in their setting in Mali, social networks were actually kind of less effective at reaching women and at helping women gain access to information about the technology, suggesting that in a sense, a direct approach to sharing information with households and making sure that women receive it would be required there to have sort of effective rollout of that information. Okay, next I want to talk about a study on just gender dimensions of another aspect of gender dimensions of information, which has to do with studying men's and women's willingness to pay for information. So in this paper, Hadrobo et al., this was the study in Ghana used a randomized encouragement design and randomized a promotion of a digital agriculture and nutrition information platform. So this end nutrition intervention was designed to provide households with access to weather information, information about prices and crops, as well as a lot of advice on agricultural practices with some new nutrition messages. And so the study actually was designed, this component of the study, to learn about essentially demand for this platform, and specifically whether men were willing to pay and women were willing to pay similar amounts. They found that both men and women were willing to pay for this information. They found it to be valuable and were willing to pay essentially, a modest but important sum for that. But that women had overall lower willingness to pay than men. And specifically, it was shown that this lower willingness to pay was actually driven by women who actually had other sources of information. So those that had other sources of information about agriculture and nutrition tended not to need this technology. They found that the platform for them would have been somewhat redundant, and so we saw lower willingness to pay there. So as we think about the rollout of digital technologies for promoting information exchange around agriculture extension, for example, here we see that its ability to reach men and women could be different, and certainly that their ability to kind of pay for that information, if it would be charged for, as it likely needs to be in the private market, that women might end up being excluded, but in some cases here, those women had other sources of information. Okay, so the last of these examples before I get to the case study on orange sweet potato is more about just a methodology. This is not specific to impact evaluations, although it's been used very well in a number of impact evaluations. It's about a methodology of trying to understand or elicit responses from survey respondents to sensitive questions or questions about sensitive behaviors. And so the example here is about intimate partner violence. And the setting is one where you want to, you can directly elicit responses to intimate partner violence, where those questions, the woman is asked whether she has experienced certain components, so physical violence, emotional violence, or sexual violence over some time period. The concern with those direct elicitation methods is that it may be that women are underreporting them, that that for a variety of reasons they don't want to reveal that, or and they maybe don't trust the survey setting, and so that in a typical direct elicitation method that these things are underreported. What the list experiment does is essentially try to measure the prevalence of these sensitive behaviors at the sample level by randomly drawing for each household, whether they're asked a set of control questions or a set of control questions plus the sensitive question about intimate partner violence. And the control questions, so there could be 4 questions about sort of activities that they normally do. These may be very benign activities, there may be some less sensitive activities, but it's things about whether they travel to market or you know, or some of their sort of routine behaviors. And they're asked to report, so they're told, say, 4 of those activities, asked to report just the total number of those activities that they do, or the total number of those statements that are true in the control condition. In the list experiment treatment condition, those same 4 questions are asked, and then an additional question, the sensitive question about intimate partner violence, is asked, and they're asked again just to report whether the total number of those things that are true, not whether each one of them is true. And then across the sample, the difference in the reported positive responses ends up being an estimate of the prevalence of the sensitive behavior. So there's some really nice research out there on list experiments, particularly for intimate partner violence, and some evidence of where it's been used well and actually seems to address the underreporting problem. You get higher rates of prevalence in some cases with list experiments, but more recent attempts with list experiments have started to call this into question. And the paper that I'm citing here that comes out of some work that we're doing in Ethiopia shows, in fact, that somewhat unexpectedly, that the list experiment actually did not reduce underreporting at all. It appears to actually increase underreporting of IPV. We think through a sort of fleeing behavior, that as women hear this set of questions and behaviors, as they hear them, the more sensitive questions, what we found is that they seem to be kind of rejecting the whole process and then sort of report really low number of positive responses. So the list experiments have been an important tool for gender research, but coming under some scrutiny after a number of recent papers on that application. Okay, so with that, now I will turn to discuss orange sweet potato. So this is research joint with my colleagues there on bargaining power, decision-making, and biofortification, and looking at the role of gender in adoption of orange sweet potato in Uganda. I realize I'm running a little bit behind time, so I will try to move a bit more quickly through these. So just the context. So looking at gender and biofortification, HarvestPlus promotes biofortification as a strategy to reduce malnutrition. This is, I think, this is a very well-known investment. It's a well-known part of the CG. And the strategy here was to use orange sweet potato. So HarvestPlus breeds staple crops such as orange sweet potato to be a rich source of missing micronutrients. So sweet potato is commonly consumed, yellow and white sweet potato in Uganda. The orange variety was bred to be a higher source of vitamin A. And so we study here, it's a promotion of orange sweet potato as a strategy to reduce vitamin A deficiency and improve vitamin A consumption in diets. This has potential, the biofortification strategy, in part because it's sustainable in rural areas, self-targeted to the poor, and could be more cost-effective over time than, for example, vitamin A supplementation. The success of biofortification depends on widespread adoption and consumption of new crop varieties. And so it's clear that gender may be very important, and that's why we wanted to study that in this study of orange sweet potato in Uganda. So the reason that gender could be important here is that women provide much of the on-farm labor in Africa and elsewhere, and they're primarily responsible for child diets. And then there's lots of evidence, and I've cited some older IFPRI research, that there is often a complex dynamic of inter-household gender relations and crop choice. And that's at the heart of what we wanted to study here, is how do households decide whether to grow orange sweet potato, and what are the different roles of men and women in that decision making. So here's the setup of the study. So HarvestPlus was going to disseminate pro-vitamin A rich orange sweet potato to increase vitamin A intakes and diets and reduce vitamin A deficiency. So 10,000 households in Uganda were going to be given orange sweet potato vines. We designed a randomized control trial with 3 intervention arms, 2 for treatments and 1 control. The 2 treatment arms varied essentially in intensity of the program, mostly through differences in the length of trainings. In Model 1, trainings went on for 2 full years and were very intensive. In Model 2, they went on for 1 year and were a bit less intensive, saving about 30% of costs. As I mentioned, this was a randomized controlled trial with 3 rounds of data collection. Our primary outcomes included orange sweet potato adoption, dietary intakes of vitamin A, and serum retinol measured in blood samples. And the questionnaire, importantly, captured gender roles in decision making, as I mentioned before. So there are both questions asked to women and men about their role in various aspects of decision making, including crop choice, and also the extent to which they own various assets in the household, both land and non-land assets. So first, just before getting to the gender component, these are just the key findings of the overall impact evaluation. So the project dramatically increased orange sweet potato adoption by 61 percentage points. So that's the share of households that adopted orange sweet potato as a result of the HarvestPlus intervention. And the share of orange sweet potato and total sweet potato area increased to 43%. So orange sweet potato started to replace white and yellow sweet potato, which is exactly the design of HarvestPlus to get more nutrient-dense crops into the field. Dietary intakes of vitamin A increased, both for 2 different cohorts of children and for adult women. And the prevalence of inadequate intakes of vitamin A fell by 33 percentage points. It's a huge reduction, a huge improvement in child diets. So our research questions on the role of gender were: how do gender dimensions of control over land and inter-household decision-making affect orange sweet potato adoption and vitamin A intakes? What is the role of women's bargaining power measured as control over assets in orange sweet potato adoption? And then last, we want to look at the role of gender and the effects of on social networks of orange sweet potato diffusion and sustainability of OSP adoption. Okay, so here's kind of the first look at what we see in terms of decision-making between men and women around orange sweet potato adoption. And so the results are shown here for the full sample and then across the 3 regions of the study. Men and women were both asked who decided what to grow on each parcel of land. And these responses were used to sort of categorize the control over each parcel as being under female control only. That's the green bar, under male control only. Or they could say, well, the decision making on that is joint. We're both involved, but then they would indicate whether the female is essentially has sort of priority there, or so that's the females first, or whether males have priority. What we see is that women alone make the crop decisions for only about 20% of land parcels. So only about 1 in 5 parcels where women have essentially sole control over decision making of what to grow there. And fully 75% of crop choice decisions at the parcel level are joint. But among those, men receive priority in decision making in as much as 80% of those decisions. Okay, so what else did we learn as we sort of looked at the role of control over decision making in orange sweet potato adoption? Well, the first thing that we learned is that the share of using as a measure of women's bargaining power, the share of land under their control or the share of their non-land assets, the share of household non-land assets that they control. So the share of those land and non-land assets exclusively owned by women does not affect the household decision to grow orange sweet potato. And this is across 4 seasons of data. So we've got a lot of data here. What you see here is that in the table is that the share of land exclusively owned by women or of non-land assets exclusively owned by women, if anything, has a small treatment effect in terms of increasing the probability that the household adopts orange sweet potato, but these effects are not significant. So the household decision here isn't being driven primarily by sort of women's control over decision making or their bargaining power within the household. So where we thought that gender, it might be women who, in a sense, become orange sweet potato champions in their household, that's certainly not driving effects at the household level. So next, we go sort of within the household to look more specifically at decision making across parcels. So household crop choice decisions are very complex, we find, and are usually joint decisions between men and women. But as I mentioned, in most cases, with the man taking the lead. What we find is that orange sweet potato adoption is most likely to occur on plots where decisions are joint, but where women play the leading role. So if we go essentially within the sort of household decision and say, well, okay, but who is actually growing this and on which plots is this showing up? What we see is that plots exclusively controlled by women are more likely to have orange sweet potato than plots exclusively controlled by men. This is sort of the difference here in column 1 between the first 2 coefficients.
Hello?
Yes, sorry. Okay, I'll continue. And then orange sweet potato adoption is significantly more likely on plots that are under joint control, in which a woman is the primary decision maker, than those under joint control where a man leads decision making. So this is the effect here, that there's about a 6 percentage point increase in the probability on plots where decision making is joint, but where the female has priority. Okay, this is my sort of last set of results, and then I'll be wrapping up. So finally, we wanted to look at the role of gender in diffusion of this technology. So orange sweet potato vines, commonly in Uganda, will spread through just sharing from household to household. It's very common for neighbors to ask to cut some vines from their neighbor's plot, and so there's a very kind of organic process of technology diffusion here. And HarvestPlus actually wanted to harness that to sort of learn more about how that diffusion could sort of assist and whether women are playing a really vital role. We found that on average in these households, every household shared orange sweet potato vines with at least one other household. The average was actually with 1.2 other households. And we actually found that women play a pretty vital role in that diffusion. What we wanted to learn here is whether women's control over assets actually, so as a measure of their bargaining power in the household, actually makes them more successful diffusers of this technology. And so what we find is that households in which women have more bargaining power based on non-land assets are more likely to share orange sweet potato vines with other households. So when they are in a position of having more bargaining power, they have more control over their decision making, and specifically they have more non-land assets, as shown in the right-hand column, then the probability that they're going to be actively engaged in technology diffusion goes up. So again, this is a sort of, the combination here of these results are, as you see, quite complex. They're quite nuanced. It's not the case that the role of women in orange sweet potato adoption and diffusion is sort of primary. It's much more complex, as you see across the literature on intra-household decision making. But we also see women playing a really vital role, and this research helped us to sort of understand that much better. So let me stop there, just in the interest of time, and yeah, back to Karen. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dan. So I'm gonna open this up for kind of questions, reactions, etc. The chat has been quiet, so I hope that means you've been sharing the questions for oral interventions. And I see a first hand. So Carmona, go ahead.
That's me, Natalia.
Sorry, Natalia, I was being too quick there. Apologies.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you, Daniel, for sharing these reflections and also for highlighting the importance of rigorous impact assessments and gender transformative approach. However, I struggle with the idea of this Western division, binary division of the world in women, men, to understand innovation and the adoption of our innovations. We know that in the real world, we have deeper structural barriers. So for example, in the US, that is a case that we are familiar. If Karen, sorry for using you in my example, we invite you and we studied you as a farmer, probably the information that research is going to give us is very little, because we know that indigenous communities or Native Americans or Black Americans or Latinos or as well transgender people, they have a different structural barriers, institutional barriers that limits them in adopting. So all that just to say that I will encourage us to think more about inclusion and gender, not as this binary division. And also I'm concerned about the unintended consequences of this in creating elites and reinforcing power dynamics or divisions that were not there in the other communities. And as the example that I give in the US, that existed all over the world with caste, ethnicities, and so on. And then the other question is also, we need to make sure about the ethics of research. I'm really concerned about us collecting information about survivors' experience and then using that for our research, but not acting upon that or helping to overcome the traumas or however. So if we are going to collect information that is so sensitive and so personal for people, so we need to have as well a mitigation or something. That's like my caveat. And I will share with you a book that I read in December that is a feminist data that I think is really good to reflect how we can move, how we think and perceive gender like beyond and think more about inclusion as an overall goal that we should achieve. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalia. I appreciate your perspective very much. Certainly, there are other dimensions of identity that are important, and within gender identity as well, going beyond sort of the women-men binary. Intersectionality is really important, sort of combining those other dimensions with gender. And that's an area of research that needs a lot more attention, say within agricultural research, agricultural economics, and certainly there's a long way to go there. So glad that you sort of brought that up. It's I recognize that, acknowledge that, and within HarvestPlus at least we're actually starting with a focus on gender, but trying with the intention of bringing in other dimensions of social inequality. So over time, the kind of perspective will grow, but there's a lot to do within research ethics. So this is something we talk about a lot, and we're deeply interested in, and we deeply care about. And this is true for our work in intimate partner violence, and I'm speaking, for many of my colleagues. There's wonderful work on cash transfer and intimate partner violence at IFPRI. Led mostly by other folks. So the process of conducting these interviews is supported by a referral system for partners that reveal that they've been a victim of intimate partner violence, that they are given resources and access to counseling and other support. So we would never go into a community and sort of ask questions like this and just sort of, you know, without having an infrastructure to support people that need it. And all of these go under ethics review. Typically at IFPRI, we have to pass ethics review both at IFPRI and in country. So we take this super seriously.
Okay.
There are always issues. I mean, these are issues that it's right to discuss. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan. There was a long comment from Trini in the chat. Trini, do you want to comment directly? I think it will help the discussion.
Yeah. Thanks, Karin. Hi, Daniel, and this is a great, nice presentation. I'm based in Uganda right now at SIP. My question, you know, I have two questions and basically a clarification, in fact. On the outcome, the primary outcome on child intake, vitamin A, you have the age brackets between 3 to 5. So when you do this baseline and endline and surveys, I mean, you had a repeated cross-sectional data sets, or is it the kind of follow-up survey? And if it is a follow-up survey, how did you control those age brackets, age, especially in the age part? That's number one. And secondly, you know, HarvestPlus is very well-known organization in Uganda as per HarvestPlus sweet potato is concerned. By the time when you get into the village, everyone knows that you are going to talk about IFPRI. Even though you have a very strong sampling design, I've been several times to villages. Like by the time, even if I'm not wearing orange color T-shirts or any no representative symbol of orange flesh or orange color, but still they know that I'm actually looking for orange flesh. Even though we are working in all type of varieties of sweet potatoes, but they directly inform you that they wanted to know about orange flesh. So I'm still wondering, you know, how did you really work out on the sampling design part? I know the designs are very good, but in reality on the ground, even though you have a very good team on the ground, and this is something a serious challenging issues, I don't know how you handle those situations on the ground. Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, that's great, Trini. Thank you for your comment. So yeah, a few things by way of reply. So the design of the age cohorts for children was really sort of explicit. So the primary age cohort first was children aged 3 to 5 years at baseline, because we wanted at end line, we were going to be taking serum blood samples to measure serum retinol as a measure of vitamin A status in blood. And we wanted to, at that point, have that cohort of children be past the age of supplementation. So there's routine vitamin A supplementation in Uganda, and the supplementation would have masked the effects of the orange sweet potato. So we designed the first age cohort to be such that they would no longer be getting vitamin A supplements. So if we saw any potential treatment effects on vitamin A status in the blood, we could be sure that that was not masked by supplementation. So that's why we actually had this was definitely an older cohort for assessing sort of child diets. We followed this up with essentially the repeated cross-section approach using data from the same households from their younger siblings. So this was a household panel data set on which we had if you will, a modified repeated cross-section, and we did supplement the sample a little bit to bring in other households at end line, just to make sure that the cross-section was essentially complete, and that we had a sort of balanced sample across sort of within age intervals on 6 to 35-month-old children. So that allowed us to do sort of the diet work, both on the more appropriate or sort of higher priority age cohort of children under age 3 or under age 2, while also looking at effects on the older children's diets and their serum retinol. This work I'm reporting on work that went on for years, and our first round of data collection was actually in 2007, just as orange sweet potato. So there was already some orange sweet potato in the field, but relatively few households. It was below 10% of households that had been growing any orange sweet potato. And so again, this is the benefit of a randomized controlled trial design. So our control group here is not the control condition, if you will, is not a set of farmers that had never seen orange sweet potato before. It was already somewhat in release, but at a really low level. And so what you described with the orange t-shirts and all of that, which we saw it wonderfully kind of spread in Uganda, and SIP did a lot of work to promote orange sweet potato. That came through, a big process by HarvestPlus and a lot of other partners. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel.
Kyle, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I'm wondering if you sort of have a favored interpretation or one you can shed light on this result, that the plots that are controlled mostly by women are more likely to be sown with orange sweet potato. I mean, I guess one possibility is that the land is more suitable. It's something, about the land that makes it more suitable for that variety. Another is that females are better at growing the crop. And so do you have a sense about like what might be behind that, or?
So I have some plausible stories, if you will, Kyle. But and I think part of this is based largely on just doing this work for quite a long time in Uganda, and working really closely with HarvestPlus and their partners on it. I think some of this pattern is driven by division of labor within the household, that these crops are considered sort of part of the household garden, if you will, and are going to be generally the preparation of the orange sweet potato for consumption in the household is done by women. And there's definitely a focus on orange sweet potato, feeding it to young children. One of the concerns, in fact, was that adult men may not be interested in orange sweet potato at all, that they would find it too sweet and too soft. In fact, so that was actually a huge concern at the start of the project, that households may not adopt it at all over kind of taste preferences of men. In fact, that concern did not bear out at all. So men were also consuming it, but it was still generally considered to be sort of the domain of sort of food that was sort of important for children. And given that women are involved in both, in cooking, like the preparation and feeding of children, I think that's part of what sort of drove it into their parcels. I mean, we don't have any information on sort of like soil quality across these parcels, for example. There are other factors at play, I'm sure, but I do think that this kind of division of labor specialization is part of it.
But you have the yield from these plots, I guess. Could you get a sense for whether, like, I'm thinking if the land is somehow different, then, one consequence of that is that the yield may be lower or higher on the plot that's controlled by females.
Yeah, unfortunately, so we do have yields. They're very noisy, and so we don't see any differences in yields over the gender of control of the plot. There may be something to that, Kyle, but it turns out to be pretty hard to measure, at least the way that we were able to do it. And so we also have like detailed dietary recall components, which are very time consuming. So our yield measures were too noisy for them.
Cool, thanks, Dan.
Thanks.
Thanks, Kyle. And so I saw there's a comment by Agnes in the chat, which, Agnes, if you don't mind, I'm gonna kind of try to draw a bit of a conclusion of several things I heard, including your comment, and then ask you to come in, if you don't mind, related to your comment. So I guess the reflection, this is kind of very much in the kind of, the looking forward, kind of what are the lessons learned from what Dan presented, but also from because Dan presented an overview of research, using these different methods on what are the lessons for the agenda on rigorous impact assessments or impact evaluations going forward for HarvestPlus, but more generally, I think for many initiatives that will be looking at gender dimensions of the CG research, and in this context where there is a lot of intentions to scale and to take things at scale, like the biofortification example is a nice example of that, because that was one of the early efforts. And so I think one of the things that comes up from the different examples that Dan talked about, some of that, which is the work that Agnes was involved in, and also from your comment, Agnes, is that in the end, very often our priors are actually wrong when we talk about the intra-household questions, because there is, exactly because there is many different dynamics going on, and you hint at many different overlapping groups, etc. And so in a certain way that calls for what you indicate, the qual-quant combinations, but it probably also calls for saying, well, if our priors are wrong, then we really want to test the priors before we scale, and kind of more generally, is there kind of a lesson there that you know can be taken forward for this agenda? Agnes, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Karen, and thanks for your presentation, Dan. I wanted to respond to this. I raised a comment about mixed methods because it's often, people often think that just because you're doing an RCT or doing a quantitative impact evaluation that you don't pay attention to these other things. That is not true. It's very often that, or increasingly, that when we do RCTs or when we do quantitative impact evaluations, that's very often accompanied by some very well thought out qualitative work. So for example, even the development of the quantitative instruments is often accompanied by qualitative protocols. ProWea, for example, was developed with a suite of qualitative protocols that's supposed to be implemented together with the index in the quantitative survey. So I think as a researcher, one has to be sensitive to what type of disadvantage is most important in that particular place. So we're finding, for example, in our work in India, that caste is very important. In our work in some parts of Africa, it's age is important. So life cycle interacts with gender. So I think as a researcher, one just has to be really aware of those things and to build that into your analysis, even if you're not maybe explicitly building that into how you design your RCT, because having gazillion treatment arms for each slice is really not feasible at all and very expensive. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And there is a hand by Manohara. Go ahead.
Hi, Karen. Hi, everyone. Very good evening from Kathmandu. Nice to learn about the research that, presented very interesting research. I don't have a very specific question to the presentation or study, but I am just, I would like to know about the scope of the HarvestPlus, because that is very clear that gender at scale is very important. Doing research on gender, intra-household, household level, community, market, institution. Whether this HarvestPlus program or our IDT initiative has really focused on understanding impact of policy governance on the gender relation and role or not. This is just my query, first query. And because ultimately the understanding gender dynamics, again, it's context specific, and also gender role is changing somehow, but the relation is really not very much enabling women to be part of the system, right? So what I see is that there is a gap in terms of understanding gendered power relationship within the institution that provide technology and services, and then how to tackle this power relation issue, methodologically, and also through the research. How do we enhance the capacity or understanding of stakeholders who deliver technology in order to empower economically or socially the farmer or people on the ground? So to have to extend the HarvestPlus, because I was not part of this, I was just curious to know about this research question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Manohara. I really appreciate it. So we're really excited about HarvestPlus because I think it's hopefully a pretty large investment in sort of new research, and hopefully going to grow the sort of CG's research. So the gender platform is already established sort of important lines of research, and the methods module, which Hazel Malapit, I think, is on our call, so which she co-leads, is already moving a lot of that forward. HarvestPlus is kind of expanding that and setting up other sort of lines of research, and certainly one of them is governance, which you mentioned. And so that's an important area. There's a work package there that Katrina Kosek is leading, which will really delve more deeply into institutions, and the early focus will be on voice and on strategies to sort of improve women's participation in decision-making processes and institutions locally and beyond. So on terms of the gap in understanding around the gender power relationship and its effect on sort of introduction of agricultural technologies, exactly. So that's, you know, that's right at the heart of what we want to be doing. The second work package is on testing bundled interventions. So not just sort of dropping kind of a seed technology with some agricultural extension on sort of how to grow it effectively, but sort of thinking about how to combine that with other interventions that would help improve its take up by women and sort of, you know, for improvements in the community. That could include some dimensions of social protection. There's been a bit of work done, Kate Ambler and Alan DeBrow, some nice work in Senegal and Malawi, where you combine cash transfers targeted to the poor with agricultural extension services to try to see if you improve take up by poor households. There are important gender dimensions to that work as well. That's an area we hope to expand. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. And so kind of, it's probably good to kind of switch to Kyle Murphy at this point. So for those who joined us a bit late, we thought it would be good to have this kind of the follow-up on this discussion on kind of, you know, some examples of the work, the gender-related impact evaluations that Dan and his team has been involved in, to then kind of in the forward-looking scope, and as we're doing this to help kind of think through what are the opportunities for answering and identifying questions related to gender in the new portfolio. We wanted to kind of we invited Kyle Murphy to introduce. So Kyle is not a CG speaker here. He comes from outside, but is speaking on behalf of the ATAI initiative, which is an initiative that is very interested and or specifically focused on agricultural technology adoption in particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and has a specific set of studies focused on gender, and a call for new studies that potentially, or for which potentially work around CG innovations could be a very good fit. And so that's why we thought it would be good for him to introduce a bit what they're doing, and then to see to what extent there may be indeed an overlap of interests. Kyle, we saw your slide for a second, but now it's gone, but maybe it's just me. I don't know if everybody else sees
we're still seeing them.
Okay, it's fine. It was just me, and I'm fine. So Kyle, over to you.
Hopefully you can hear me. Yeah. And thanks, Dan, for that was a really excellent presentation. So I'm also joined by my colleague Brindha Gopalakrishnan, who directly manages the Agricultural Technology Adoption Initiative. So I'll go through some background on what we do and some thoughts on, in particular, where gender is important to our work and where overlaps with the CGs will hopefully lead to new research partnerships. So Brindha, if you could move on. Sorry, I've been having some computer problems, so Brinda's very graciously sharing her screen. Thank you. So the Agricultural Technology Adoption Initiative is co-managed by the Center for Effective Global Action at the University of California, Berkeley, and by the Jameel Poverty Action Lab at MIT, where Brindha and I are based. And we're generously supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and FCDO. So we've been around for a while now, and in the first phase, we were very focused on looking at different constraints of technology adoption and access to market for small-scale farmers in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and evaluating the impact of interventions meant to ease those different constraints to technology adoption. So we fund randomized evaluations to academic randomized evaluations to both. We try to fill in the gaps between funding studies that will answer private goods questions for a particular implementer on, does this program work? How can we improve it? What are the drivers of impact? And answer these broader academic questions of, in general, what can we learn about what is hindering technology adoption among small-scale farmers. Since 2019, we've pivoted a bit to not be just looking at technology adoption, but being increasingly focused on connections to markets and agricultural transformation, and not just on farm level adoption, but looking at impacts at a market level. Brindha, if you could move on, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. So our priorities are, as I mentioned, these investments which will move towards transformative outcomes. So thinking about things like the share of outputs sold at market, the pricing in of quality, things like that, and bundled programs that are simultaneously relaxing multiple constraints to technology adoption, so that are addressing credit and risk and information all at once, and also where the research design facilitates being able to disentangle which of these are really driving the impact. Things having to do with supply chain interventions or value chain development, and studies that have statistical power to look at general equilibrium effects or market level outcomes. And as I mentioned, our geographic focus is in sub-Saharan Africa. We can also fund projects in South Asia. There has to be some argument that there's a similar constraint faced or a similar issue somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, and that the results of the study will be able to inform something there. If you could keep going, thank you. So one thing that has been a priority for a while, but has been difficult to source projects, is on gender in particular. And as Dan mentioned as well, that there's a significant evidence gap on interventions that specifically benefit or empower women in agricultural transformation. So some of the things we've done to date are related to what Dan said, are that we have specific review criteria along looking at gender for all proposals that come in. We require gender disaggregated results for all of our funded RCTs. That said, they're not all necessarily powered to get at those impacts. And then for particular projects, we ask them to add on a diagnostic module that's based on the ProWea. And Agnes, thank you very much for all of your help in designing that a couple of years ago. So what we've done since then as well is we've launched a particular RFP window for gender and agricultural transformation. And the idea here is that we've had a lot of proposals in the past that include gender as or outcomes, gender disaggregated outcomes, but what we're really interested in here are funding randomized evaluations of interventions where gender is a key component of their theory of change. So rather than just looking at potential unintended consequences for women, projects that at their core are meant to target women. So as this says here, we're specifically looking for projects where distinctions between men and women suggest that alternative interventions are needed. And where the areas where we've identified, and we had a researcher convening a couple years ago that was quite helpful in narrowing down where we thought these funds could be most effective, but looking at land markets and property rights, differences in bundling of services, the access to output markets, and household diversification strategies within beyond agriculture, especially within the context of the adoption of new crops or technologies. So now Brindha will walk through a bit of it. We've expanded past ATAI and recently launched a digital agriculture innovations and services initiative, which I think is also relevant. But go ahead, Brindha.
Thanks, Kyle. So yeah, we just wanted to quickly touch on a new initiative that we just launched in collaboration with SIGA, again, based at UC Berkeley. And we launched this initiative with the support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the focus of this initiative actually draws quite heavily from JPAL's existing research and the evidence gaps that we found in ATAI's research as well. So this initiative is definitely more nuanced and is focused on kind of funding research related to the impact of digital tools and more specifically digital platforms that connect farmers to kind of multiple services at once. And in this context, when we refer to digital services, we mean platforms that leverage things like mobile phones or the internet and other digital tools that are often kind of integrated into one platform or program. But just for some context, the majority of ATAI's research so far, especially in that first phase that Kyle was kind of talking about, has mostly focused on alleviating kind of one constraint area that farmers face at a time, such as risk through insurance or the lack of information through extension services. But I think bundled services is especially relevant, given that it has a potential to kind of address these multiple constraints that smallholder farmers may face. And finally, I think another reason why this is particularly relevant is because of the rapid development and growth of implementers in this space who are increasingly using digital technologies to deliver things like financial services and insurance and other things. And again, the regional focus for this initiative, similar to ATAI, will be on sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And then you can also see on the slide here that one of the big cross-cutting focuses of this initiative will be gender, given that there is not a lot of evidence on how these types of services can benefit and empower women. So we do have an explicit goal of increasing the pipeline of research related to digital agricultural services and women's empowerment. Yeah, and we haven't yet released an RFP and are still in the process of working with researchers in our network to convene and come up with a more succinct research agenda, but we will keep you updated as we develop our research priorities further and release an RFP, which will likely be in the summer of this year. And I think Ricardo mentioned that there are a lot of questions around funding and eligibility for our RFPs. So I wanted to quickly touch on this as well. So on ATAI, we generally fund 3 types of studies. The first is a travel or proposal development grant that typically funds costs related to very preliminary and exploratory research. For instance, many PIs use this to get reimbursements for international travel or per diem or for accessing data for designing an RCT in the future. And the cap for these types of grants is typically $10,000. And then apart from this, we also fund pilot projects and full RCTs ranging from $75,000 for a pilot up to $500,000 for a full study. And then pilot studies usually are kind of piloting a full-scale RCT and are thus smaller in scope, but they're also generally required to have a research question, and many pilot studies are usually kind of testing out an intervention or evaluation design to lay the groundwork for assessing the feasibility of an RCT. And then for DAISY, we'll also be accepting applications for rapid A/B tests and scaling grants. And these rapid product tests will center around kind of quickly iterating with developers to improve platforms or services during the initial phases of implementation or rollout. And this could involve both qualitative tests of the product before it's launched, as well as kind of A/B tests of the specific aspect of the platform or tool. And then scaling grants generally involve kind of adapting a program for scale or piloting a scalable evidence-informed solution, but we don't anticipate that this will happen in our very first year of funding. And then finally, in terms of eligibility, our RFP is open to JPAL and SIGA affiliated professors and all active invited researchers to any JPAL initiative or regional offices. And graduate students who have an eligible researcher as an advisor are also able to apply. However, for researchers based at non-academic institutions, you are not directly eligible to apply, but you can always team up with another eligible researcher to apply for funding. So a JPAL or SIGA affiliate or invited researcher. But with that, I think I'll actually hand it back over to Kyle, who will talk about kind of the matchmaking services that we offer and how we could potentially help you with developing and partnering with an eligible researcher. Kyle, is your connection okay? Do you want to talk about matchmaking?
It sounds like there's an audio problem. You're on mute, Kyle, but I think that's not the issue. I think we actually lost Kyle.
I think it might be a connection problem.
Yeah. Brindha, can you do this last part, or should we first take a question before? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. I think.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we do.
Oh, Kyle's back. Yeah.
Kyle, go ahead if you're back.
Oh, I think he might have left again. But I think ultimately for our matchmaking services, we have we're always willing to kind of talk with any researchers who have an interest or have a project idea on a focus area of our RFP. And usually we have a sense of what the interests are for other researchers in our network. So we could potentially help link you with other eligible researchers who are JPAL affiliates or SIGA affiliates or are invited researchers to help like create that match and see if they're interested in collaborating with you to kind of apply for funding and work on that project together. And yeah, I think that pretty much covers it, but I can take any questions while Kyle kind of deals with this connectivity in the meantime.
Thanks, Brindha. And so I'm gonna open it up indeed for questions. Just to, I guess, to maybe one more piece of context here, and the reason why we invited Kyle and Brindha is that so we've talked with some of you before. This is kind of an initiative interested in the very topics that we're talking about. It and aims to kind of do these kind of matchmaking exercises with kind of academic researchers that are interested in those topics. And so since a lot of this kind of RCT work anyway is best done in teams, that's not necessarily a constraint, but rather an opportunity, and also something where Spia can help in initial steps of that matchmaking process, in addition to the services that JPAL directly offers. Trini, you had a question, so your hand is down, but I think you had a question. So
yeah,
go ahead.
I mentioned the chat box, but yeah, it's more look like what we had this with Spia. The pilot phase studies, is it necessary to have a piggyback projects, in the sense like the activities are all not funded by these funds, or we have to take this 50,000 or 75,000, whichever amount we get, it's utilized only for conducting the study?
Yeah, so you are allowed to have co-funding from if you have funding from other organizations and have a project idea that they're funding a part of, then you can use our funding to complete the rest of your activities, if that answers your question.
Sorry, so I mean, maybe I should put it a little bit different. Is it a mandate as per qualifications to apply? I must have a piggyback project to get these funds, or I can just write a pure research proposal and submit for this call.
Brindha, Yeah, Brindha, let me do a little bit of translation here. So
Okay.
I think the Trini, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm understanding is your question is do you need to have funding for the actual operations of the project? So kind of you're diffusing information, you're doing an extension project, whatever it is. Does that needs to be funded? And then what the ATAI funding is for is the additional research. Or is there also potential to fund the actual operations of the whether it's the extension project, etc.
I think I'm back. I think if I can answer that. So yes, typically we can't fund implementation related expenses, just research related expenses. There are some exceptions if, for example, you're adding a different treatment arm to try to get at some kind of disaggregated measurement, and that adds some additional cost. Then we can fund the marginal cost of doing that, but it has to be something that's related to the research design.
Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, thanks, Brindha.
Other questions? So one reflection while I wait to see whether there's other questions. So it is partly because of this question that Trini asked, is that the most natural places, I think, where there is a synergy and interest is exactly there where, as part of the new initiatives, there are scaling efforts already being planned. There is potentially scaling partners there or not that could be open for that. That could be also through in particular, maybe for some of the regional initiatives, but not only the regional initiatives, for sure. And so where those scaling efforts happen, but where there is opportunities to identify research questions, particularly gender-related ones, that would speak to this common agenda. That those are the ones I think that would be good. And so I think the idea of the presentation by Dan was to say, okay, we actually, we've done some of this in the CG, and so there is probably many more opportunities of doing that. And if we kind of collectively think, if you this is not collectively, but each of you, based on the initiatives you're working on, kind of see opportunities where okay, we're going to be scaling. There is actually an opportunity there's some real questions in the theory of change that would be worth thinking through, and there may be ways of getting some additional funding to test those rigorously. I guess that's where the nice synergy is. Kyle, Emmerich.
Yeah, thanks, Brindha and Kyle. I guess just a thought. It might be useful to give the people on this call kind of a sense of what the best step to take would be if they have an idea that they think is a good fit for ATAI or DAISY. Would it be to reach out directly to you, or would it be to go through like a partner development form at the, a JPAL country office, or to really sort of facilitate, that process?
Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, I think well, you might have thoughts about how we might go about it better as well, since I know we've reached out to you a lot in the past with these. But I think, yeah, the best route is we're happy as staff on ATAI and DAISY to, I think if you reach out directly, if you have any ideas, we can help you think through whether it would be a good fit, what element of it might be most interesting for funding, and then we have an information gathering form just that has some questions about the intervention itself and timeline, and so some logistics questions, and then from there we're happy to think through a bit within the network of eligible researchers who might be a good fit for a partner. And then typically what we do there is we'll reach out to a few people and gauge interest, and then make a couple of introductions, and then from there, as staff at least, we step back a bit, but typically that's how we treat it. I don't know if Karen, if you have any thoughts from Spia's point of view of what you might do.
Yeah, no, that's right. And so we've had, we've had some experience where where kind of Spia can help in that initial step of kind of thinking through, including, looking at that partnership development form once you've had a look, and kind of, since we know a bit both communities, doing some of this, I guess what I call translation work, to make sure we're speaking the same language is something we can help with, and be happy to help with. So. Trini?
Sorry, Karen, if I get a chance to ask one more question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You talked about studies that are related to value chain studies. I mean, typically kind of agribusiness. And nowadays, there are a lot of agribusiness firms are now using these digital tools and addressing even some gender-related issues on the ground. So in the pilot phase call, like, is it necessary to have a kind of very hardcore evidence-based RCT or small RCT design, whichever way you like to call it, with econometrics analysis? Is it required to have such kind of analysis on the pilot phase? Because this is something agribusiness, imagine there is something that you can try to showcase the evidence with the agribusiness tools. There are a lot of agribusiness management tools that can showcase the evidence, not necessarily with the econometric analysis. But what is the way you guys were thinking for the pilot phase? I'm very particular about the fonts that are available for the pilot phase, which can help us to write a bigger full-scale RCT design. Because often the pilot scale, is it really necessary to have some hardcore econometric analysis, or I can also work on agribusiness using agribusiness management tools to showcase the difference evidence? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question, and I guess there are a couple of things there. Yeah, absolutely. The pilots don't need to have randomization. There needs to be, exactly as you said, I think the use case that you pointed out is exactly what we have in mind. In some cases, they do have a randomization, but in many, it's some kind of more descriptive data gathering or analysis that's meant to set parameters or assess the feasibility of a full-scale RCT. So there doesn't need to be a randomization at the pilot phase. What there does need to be is some connection and argument for the activities that are undertaken under a pilot grant are going to enable a later full-scale RCT. And I think you make a very good point there, especially under DAISY. We're prioritizing and interested in working much more with the private sector. And I think different tools are probably necessary to convince them that a randomized evaluation is worth it later. But we're very excited to work with the CG.
Yeah, true. Especially you pointed about these private sectors, it's really challenging when we work with the private sectors. Yeah, thank you so much, Kyle. Yeah, thanks for the clarification.
Excellent. With that, let me try to wrap this up, partly because I do have a hard stop myself, but also to stick to everybody's time commitments. Dan, Brindha, Kyle, thank you very much for those presentations and for kind of helping us think through the future. Agnes, thanks also for coming in, and everybody else on the call who has contributed to this agenda or will do so in the future. Thank you, and hope to see you in a month on the next webinar. Take care.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks, everyone.